Okay, welcome to the Art Gallery in the library, everyone. And before we start, I wish you all a happy Library Week. You may or may not know that this is the week when Turkey celebrates libraries and librarians and so on. That's why we are treble booked today. We have 3 activities going on at the very moment in the library, and in an hour or so, some students from Mamak, or a school in the area, will be coming to have a little tour of the library and learn about what we do here and so on. So I wish you all a happy Library Week. We are here, of course, now to hear the second lunchtime lecture for this semester, and I'm happy to welcome Professor Carnot Nilsson, the acting chair of the psychology department in Bilkent, as our speaker today. His title, A Typical Turkish Leadership Style, Paternalistic Leadership Comparisons Within Turkey and Cross-Nationally. Of course, Turkish leadership is a subject that we're all thinking about and speaking about and writing about and so on a lot at the moment. Whether he will delve into recent developments or not remains to be seen. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Nelson before I give the floor to him. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then he went to Columbia to pursue his PhD in social psychology. After lecturing briefly in Emory University and the Johns Hopkins University, he joined the faculty at University of South Florida in 1971, and he's Professor Emeritus of Psychology there to this day. He joined Bilkent 3 years ago, 2011, I think, but he was no newcomer to Turkey at that time, having spent time as a senior Fulbright scholar a few years earlier, 2006, in Hacettepe and in Metu, and in 2009 briefly teaching a few courses at Bilkent. But we're happy that we have caught him and snared him to us full-time now. His publications cover over 50 serious articles and book chapters and a number of books. And his research interests include utilization of scientific knowledge and the program evaluation, and more recently he's been working on the issues of leadership style. He has many professional associations, including he's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, and the Association for Psychological Science, and he's been the editor and reviewer for many academic journals over the years. His personal interests apparently include reading mystery novels and history. As an historian, I can vote for that. And he added as a note that this year, very recently, he and his wife celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, so congratulations there. Okay, enough of me. I shall turn the floor and the microphone to Professor Nelson. Please switch off your phones or anything else that may interrupt the talk, and we're hoping to have 5 or 10 minutes at the end for some discussion. Okay, thank you.
Hopefully. Thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day. It's spring here. Baseball season started. I'm ready. What I want to do today is talk about some of our research we're recently conducting here in Turkey. Let me outline what we're going to talk about. First thing I want to do is define what we mean by paternalistic leadership, and I think that's important, and discuss how we measure it a little bit. Then we're going to move into an area of looking at differences within Turkey. What happens here, and you'll see in a minute, that many times people talk about countries as unified, a unified culture, and that's just not the case. And there's been very little research looking at differences, and we have 2 studies, one dealing with who owns the company. Is it family-owned, government, or multinational, and what's the impact there? The second one is type of worker, and there we're looking at blue-collar versus white-collar workers, and that difference. And finally, we're going to talk about a study where we collected data from the United States, Turkey, and Armenia. And we're going to look at comparisons there. So that's what I'm trying to do here, to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Now, what is paternalistic leadership? Basically, it's a hierarchical leadership where the leader not only guides the professional life, but also the personal life of the person. It's the father figure, if you will. That's exactly what we mean. And what happens here, the father, and we'll see in a minute, takes care of the child or the employees, and the employees show deference, show loyalty, and obey the leader. And that's what we're talking about. So there are really 4 types of leadership here. The one we're going to talk about is what we call benevolent leadership, benevolent paternalism. And here, the situation is that the leader really cares about the individual. That's the key. And you have another kind that's called exploitive, and the difference between the two is what is the intent of the leader. In the first case, it's benevolence. In the second case, I want to use those people. It's very different, because there, to get rewards and so forth, they obey. They're being exploited by the leader. An authoritative approach is where people will obey or follow a leader because the person knows a lot and can help them in that way. And finally, we have the authoritarian kind of approach, where basically what happens is you obey to get rewards or you're going to get punished. It's as simple as that. The work that we're talking about is focused on benevolent paternalism. And it's basically caring about the employee, both personal life and in, if you will, the job itself. There's a decision-making piece to this, the notion that father knows best. So what happens is you do not criticize the decisions that come from the leader. You accept them, you follow them, you don't criticize. The third one I have here is getting involved in the non-work domain. And by that I mean going in and talking about family issues, going to funerals, going to weddings. There was a company that we dealt with once that the manager, who was a member of the family, it was a family-owned firm, would greet every employee when they walked in and when they left every day. And they were very proud that they had, frankly, a fund put aside in case something happened to the company, the employees would be taken care of. That kind of thing is what we're talking about here. I think that's a decent example. On the other hand, what happens is that the individual employee has to show deference and loyalty to the company. In other words, you respect the leader, you do what they tell you. That's part of what's happening here. So if you take a look at the subscales of the leadership scale, and if we have time, if you're interested, I have the scales with me. But basically, this is work that the scale we use is from Zeynep Aycan at Koç University. And basically, you have a number of, as we call, subscales. One is looking at the family or creating a family atmosphere in the workplace. That's one piece. We also have, and let me, I have it right here. For example, that's the best way to do it. Provides advice to families or to the employee like a senior family member. Establishing close and individualized relationships with subordinates, shows emotional reactions such as joy, sour, anger in his relationship with the employee. Another one is it's important to establish one-to-one relationships. Getting involved in the non-work domain, doesn't hesitate to take action in the name of his or her employees whenever necessary, attend special events of the employee, expecting loyalty, is does not consider performance as the most important criterion for making decisions about employees, and authority and status, maintaining that, wants to control, to be informed of all work-related activity. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of questions that are asked. So let's talk about Turkish business culture. There are two things that are very important when we talk about culture. One is the collectivism in Turkey. And this is a cultural variable. It's the focus on the group rather than the individual. In the United States, for example, we're very individualistic in terms of what we do and how we look at ourselves and how we define ourselves. In Turkey, it's much more concerned with the group itself in that way. So that what you do is you put your goals in terms of not your individual goals, but the group goals. That becomes important. And the group and the interaction in that group becomes key for the individual. The other thing that we have is something called power distance. And that is the extent to which the community accepts and endorses authority and power differences and status privileges. And Turkey, very high on power distance. You can see that very clearly. My favorite example of that is a colleague who came from Turkey. She was a postdoc, came to South Florida, and kept referring to me as Dr. Nelson. This drove me crazy. I said to her, please, you're a colleague, okay? It's Carnot. She said, I can't do it. I said, what? I said, what's the problem? She said, you're older, you're more senior. So we finally compromised. I became Carnot Hojum. And literally that is what the kind of thing that happens here. So there is this tremendous power distance where in the United States, it's much less. So from that, frankly, it correlates, leads to this paternalistic leadership. That's where it comes from. These are major cultural variables in Turkey. Now, the first study, we wanted to look at type of ownership. And we did that for basically two reasons. One is that, as I said, people really have not looked at within-country differences. They haven't. You have the Globe study, which is a study of leadership with about 40 different countries, many of them, but they don't look at that. And some of the literature has, in fact, encouraged that. Gelfand and al., for example, Fisher has, I think, the most interesting thing, where he says that the social cultural variables on organizational practices are stronger in indigenous organizations compared to multinationals. And this was part of the stimulus for what we were doing, frankly. So that's why we did it. Now, what our hypotheses were is looking at family-owned, public organization, multinational. We look at organizational collectivism. That is the extent to which people in the organization look at the organization as a group rather than for individual rewards. It's group reward versus individual. Paternalistic leadership. LMX is leader-member exchange. And here it's looking at the dyad, the leader and the subordinate, or the supervisor and subordinate. And here we have a situation where, if you think about it, you realize that in many cases, you have a leader and you have subordinates, and there are two kinds of subordinates. One's in which there is a very close relationship, where there's a trusting relationship, where the individual then, the leader or supervisor may give the other person extra duties to do importance, rewards, whatever. And the other kind of situation is where you have the individual, frankly, is, okay, he works there, you supervise him, but there isn't that kind of relationship. And so that is one of the variables we measured. Another one was obviously how satisfied you were with your supervisor. And finally, OCB, and that is organizational citizenship behavior. This is extra role behavior that people do that's not part of their job. For example, might be helping a coworker or taking extra care of a customer. So this is another thing that we've measured. And so this is where we were in this study, and what happened? We have the best results one could imagine. Take a look. Ooh, I can do that. Okay, if you take a look at every variable, you have family-owned, public organizations, and multinational. And if the letters are different across the row, that means those two are significantly different than one another. So what do you have here? In family-owned, we have higher organizational collectivism and paternalistic leadership, LMX and OCB, okay? Then comes our public organizations, they're number 2, and multinationals are number 3. The only place where there is no difference is supervisor satisfaction. Everybody's happy with their supervisor to a certain extent. Okay? Can everybody see that, I hope? So anyway, what this says is, hey, our hypotheses were supported, that in fact this is what's going on. You can see, as we say, the culture is suppressed in the multinational corporations. They are different. And this becomes sort of important because if you are a multinational corporation, okay, you come to Turkey, if you don't understand the culture, you're not going to be able to do business. You're not going to be able to supervise your employees. At the same time, what happens is that because it's a multinational, it brings in its culture. And its culture tends to suppress the national culture. It's an interesting kind of give and take. And what this means, obviously, in the long run, as you have more and more multinational companies working, the influence of the culture itself, internal culture, will be reduced. That's what was so interesting here. Now, we also looked at relationships between all these variables. And there's one thing I really want to show here, and that is this correlation. Okay, collectivism, paternalistic leadership, related to LMX, fine. Supervisor satisfaction, of course. No relationship with organizational citizenship behavior. We're going to talk about that in a second. Keep that in mind. Then, public organizations, the same kind of relationships. Multinational. Notice the difference here. Highly significant relationship between LMX and OCB. In other words, the closer your relationship with your supervisor, the more you're going to do that extra behavior, extra kind of thing. But only in the multinational. That's the key. So, what do I conclude from all of this? Well, one, the proposition that Fisher had about the suppression is clearly supported. The culture went down. There's no question. It says also it stimulated us and says, wait, we have to look at more within-country differences. This was the first study that was done, frankly. LMX is a mediator between paternalistic leadership and satisfaction that you don't have to worry about. But now, let's look at OCB. I think what is happening here, if we take a look and conceptualize the job as a, if you will, a family, then what happens is that organizational citizenship behavior is a natural kind of thing to do. If you're in a family and somebody asks you to do something extra, you're going to do it. You don't consider it unusual. It does not depend on your relationship to your father, if you will. It's just what is expected of one. So that's what I think is happening. The other thing is, we were the first, well, one of the few studies that look at organizational collectivism, and we wanted to continue to look at this. So, that was our first study. The second study was done by, last year, a senior thesis student of mine, Ezgi, and what we wanted to do here, she was interested in, is the difference between blue-collar and white-collar workers. And because one time we looked at organizational variable, here we're looking at a personal variable, if you will. And we said, well, what are the influences, or what are the characteristics? And for blue-collar workers, they tend to be less educated, more traditional, physical labor, and white-collar, higher education, more modern, cognitive labor, they think. So what do we have here? We looked at, again, mean leadership differences, average differences between paternalistic leadership, collectivism. We also brought in power distance here, because we wanted to measure that for the first time. And we looked at an LMX, again, across blue and white collar workers. Here are the results. And they're pretty clear. In fact, very clear. In each case, blue collar workers are higher in organizational collectivism, how they perceive the organization, in how they perceive power distance, if you will. They perceive paternalistic leadership is higher, and they perceive LMX, leader-member exchange, is higher. Yeah, I got that. Notice what we find again, which brings a similarity between the two studies. We don't find any difference in supervisor satisfaction. They're pretty happy. It's a 5-point scale. So what we have here is, if you will, another variable looking at within-country differences that give the same kind of results. And basically, you know, we looked at correlational differences. There's very little just between supervisor satisfaction and blue-collar workers. It was significant, not for white-collar. And all the variables are higher in blue-collar workers, which tends to tell us that what we have here is a pervasive influence of traditional culture. So you have to look not only at the organization, but you're going to have to also look at the culture, at the type of worker you're talking about. Our third study is dealing with leadership cross-culturally. And we wanted to look at what its effects were. And we have 3 countries, which are probably very unusual: Turkey, the United States, and Armenia. We collected data, And what we find here is a very interesting kind of relationships where, surprisingly, if you look here, I'm getting good at this, if individualism and collectivism are both higher in Turkey than in the US and in Armenia. And what this seems to tell us, or at least our thinking at this point, is that Turkey is going through a change. There is a major cultural change happening here. In terms of being more collectivist originally, but what's happening is there's a modernism coming. And that means more individualism. That's at least our thinking right now, and that's pretty tentative. Paternalistic leadership, higher in Turkey than everybody else. The United States was fairly high. And my thinking on this, and we're not the only ones that have found this. There's one other study that has looked at this, and they found the same thing. And I think what is happening here is that what we are measuring in the United States is a mentoring relationship, which is very different, where in fact the variables seem to be the same, the questions, but the motivation of the leader is somewhat different. And there may not be the extent of deference, for example. I don't know. This is a hypothesis we have. It's something I'd like to look at in the future. Job satisfaction in Turkey, people are more satisfied, or at least in our samples. And the final one was supervisor support. And here, the United States and Turkey are pretty much the same. How much supervisor support you get from your supervisor. Armenia is lower. We're replicating a lot of this in the second study because this is all new stuff, frankly. So we've also looked at relationships here, and there are a couple of things I think we need to talk about. One is that if you look at paternalistic leadership here, collectivism is related to it, and here it is related to job satisfaction and supervisor support in Turkey. You see the United States, same relationships. Exactly. Finally, Armenia, it's different. I don't know what's going on with Armenia. But here, individualism is related to paternalistic leadership, and collectivism, although significant, is much less. So you have a difference here that we're trying to figure out what's happening. It may, something in the culture, I have to talk to my Armenian colleagues about this. So, what can we conclude? Well, one is that there are effects of individualism and paternalism on paternalistic leadership from this study. That paternalistic leadership is really cross-cultural. It goes across. We know that there's data from the Far East, China, Japan, and so forth, showing, again, a very paternalistic kind of society in the organization. And second, I think third, there are positive effects of paternalistic leadership. Look, it's correlated with job satisfaction. And that's important. Because people who are satisfied, sometimes do a better job. So what do I want you to take home? Well, that there are positive impacts of paternalistic leadership. Caring for the employee is important. Certainly, it's expected and liked in Turkey. There are positive organizational outcomes. However, there are negative impacts. And one is in decision-making. All decision-making is at the top. You don't question. And this can lead very quickly to something called groupthink that was devised or proposed by Irving Janis, a social psychologist, and he was talking about the Bay of Pigs fiasco. For those of you that are not as old as I am, And right after President Kennedy became president, a group of Cubans with CIA help invaded Cuba to try to overthrow Castro. It was a fiasco. And people asked, why could such brilliant people make such stupid decisions? And the question, and Janice said, look, you had a group that was very highly cohesive. They felt they were being attacked from the outside. He just won the election. It was very close. You had a very strong leader. And in that kind of situation, are you going to say, you know, this is a stupid idea that you're presenting? Because what's going to happen to you if you do? You're going to be pushed out of the group, and nobody wants to do that. And that's what happens. Now, Kennedy learned his lesson very quickly. He was smart. When, a year later, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia or Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba. He brought his team together, and he appointed somebody a devil's advocate, which is the person that criticizes everything that's said. And he picked a good one, somebody he really trusted, his attorney general, his brother, Bobby. And what happened? It worked. That's what bothers me. The other thing that happens, and we think, and we're checking on this, is the lack of initiative in employees. People are afraid to go beyond. It's a very cultural thing in Turkey. They're afraid to take risks, to take chances. There's a mixing of the personal life and the job, where you have paternalistic leadership. And finally, there's too much control. There's a lot of control from the top. And I think those are some negative impacts. I'm actually going to have time for questions. Where are we going with our research right now? Frankly, the first thing we're going to look at is more within country differences. One of the things we're fascinated by is generational differences. What are the differences that occur because of the generation you're in? There's my generation, if you will. Please, I get sensitive. Then there is the generation of my colleagues, which is my children's generation. And then obviously, I have another generation of my grandchildren, my grandsons. Now, what is the difference in those generations? And that's important because I think you're going to see change. And that's going to have an important impact in where Turkey goes and where other countries go if you see this. So that's one level. The other is level of education. What's the impact of level of education on this? And decision making. We want to look more at the decision making styles that are used, how the employees perceive the managerial decision making. The other thing that we're interested in is the negative effects of paternalistic leadership. And finally, we're interested in continuing our work cross-nationally. We have a study now where we have, hopefully have data from Germany, Spain, and Hungary, in addition to our regular 3. So that's the topic. I thank you very much for taking your lunchtime to come and listen, and I think you'd like questions.
Let's first say thank you. Since I am the benevolent paternalistic leader here, I will initiate the discussion. Okay, no, joke. So yes, as Carnot says, do we have any questions for that very interesting and stimulating talk?
Yeah.
Okay, our friends, psychology friends.
Go ahead.
Ladies first, Kathy.
My colleagues, yeah, uh-huh.
So, 2 questions. One is, what kind of companies did you include?
Right.
For example, the other one is, how did you make sure it's benevolent paternalism? Okay,
the questionnaire, that's a good question, both of them. The first one is the first study was just random. Wherever we could get them, we did. And they were from all over Turkey, Western Turkey. My colleague, Savaş Şalan at Hacettepe, had his students collect data, frankly. The second study was done in government agencies in one city, and I pronounce it wrong. Anyway, it's S-A-Y. My pronunciation of Turkish is brutal. So, but anyway, it was collected there by one of our students. So as far as benevolent, we're not sure of the intent, but it's our feeling that that's what's happening. The questionnaires and so forth are written in such a way that you really don't know the intent of the supervisor. But typically, I think what we're seeing from talking to people is more benevolent. That's a good question. I'd like to figure out, probably ask another question in another study, is okay, what do you think the reason is? Whether they'll tell you or not, of the employee, how do they perceive it? So this is their perceptions. Yeah.
I have a technical question. If it's not too much trouble, can you go back to the table of study 3?
Sure. Let's see if I can do that. There.
This,
Yeah.
Yes, Carnot. Here,
Uh-oh, I'm getting trouble.
I see that Turkey, people in Turkey who took the survey always give higher
It may be.
answers. So could there be a bias? In this?
Sure, absolutely.
So
They-
then we can, how do you deal with such
Well,
bias?
what I would do then is look at the average score on all the scales and then do a standard deviation. It's
So
technical.
normalizing,
Yeah, normalizing would be a way to do it, if we had
because
to.
even though collectivism is high in the US also, right?
Well, there are some differences.
But if I look at the difference between individual and collectivism,
That's,
it's the opposite. There's a
Yeah.
contrast. Turkey individualism less than collectivism. US is the opposite.
yeah, I don't think there's much difference. I don't think there's any difference between these two figures, obviously. Here there probably is. We haven't looked at it. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
These questions that you were asking could be also asked by a sociologist or a cultural anthropologist, it seems to me. So I wonder how you would characterize how psychology is posing the question and
Good question.
doing the methods.
I think a couple of things. One, in psychology, we focus on the individual rather than a group. And I think that's a major kind of difference. The other major difference is we're very quantitative. We're very big in numbers. So I think that although the topic could be looked at from a variety of perspectives, and that would be wonderful, it's the industrial organizational psychologists who are interested in what's going on in the organization. So that's how we got into it. We're closer, frankly, to people in business schools who study organizational behavior. But I can see how it could be studied in other ways. Other questions?
Charles.
Yeah.
I have a question and a comment. The comment is you could also look at this other than the intergenerational aspect, you could look at from the point of view of gender differences. Right?
Yes, we have not.
Supervisors' gender versus supervisees' gender, how these relationships might change according to
I like that.
gender differences. And my question is, how did you measure some of these things, individuals and collective? What are the questions that you asked?
I just brought the questionnaire with me. Okay. For example, collectivism. Employees, this is organizational collectivism. Employees share responsibility for the organization's failures as well as success. That's an example of the question. Individualism, employees value independence on their jobs. So that gives you an idea of that. In the LMX, a questionnaire would be, my supervisor recognizes my potential. He understands my problems and needs. Well, satisfaction, you know, my supervisor is unfair to me, or I like my supervisor. And then OCB, what we did, the scale we used had a number of activities. For example, covered a coworker's mistake, or brought candy, donuts, snacks, or drinks for coworkers. So those are the kinds of things we measure. And what we do on these scales, frankly, is look at their reliability and validity. And by looking at the validity, I'm talking two things. One is concurrent validity, which means that scales should be correlated or related to similar things, and divergent validity. In other words, there should be no relationships where you expect them. And all the scales we use are standard. Some actually were developed in Turkey. Those that weren't, what we did is we actually translated them and then back translated them. And we did that by having native Turkish speakers do it, who are bilingual. So, and then what I would do is I would look at the back translation, compare it to the original, and to see how well it came out. And there would be discussion back and forth. So this is the way we develop these scales. We're very careful on how we do that. Yeah. Yes.
Carnot. I don't know if organizational psychologists apply their work to organizations such as political parties, but as a formal political scientist, this seems like a natural application to the political party situation in Turkey. Have there been, first of all, do you look at political parties at all, or is that a totally different animal?
That's a totally different animal.
And could this apply to that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I know.
Next study.
No, I think it does. I think there's a, you know, the analogy is so strong. It helps me. If somebody says to me, for example, from the States, what is going on in Turkey? I don't understand it. This helps me understand it. That's where I'm coming from on this. Have I studied what people think and so forth? No. The political situation. I think, you know, frankly, and this is my personal opinion, that many of the leaders in Turkey believe in this paternalistic leadership. And that's what you're seeing. And that may be a ramification of what's happening. That's my personal opinion. Okay, I have no data to back it up, but that's where I would stretch it.
But in terms of your field, you don't look at organizations such as political parties. That would be a different animal.
Yeah, it is fair, because many of them are voluntary organizations. They're very different. Yeah.
There was a question over here.
Yes.
I may be asking the same question, but looking at this, I kept wondering and going back to your first study where there were the government-owned, the family-owned, and then the multinational companies.
Right.
So we don't really know what the mixture is for any of these samples for Turkey, US, and Armenia, but is that correct?
Yeah.
I think that's what Katya asked.
Yeah, I know, because because we get, frankly, we get a sample wherever we can get them. People get them from a variety of organizations. There may be organizational differences.
Yeah. In light of your first study's results, though, it makes me think that if we actually knew for later study, for
Right.
future, it'd be very interesting to look at.
Well,
also
we have
considering the generational
Yeah.
differences.
Well, with the data we're collecting now, we're fortunate because we're looking at people that are involved in customer service. So they all at least have that. Now, some may be multinational, some may not, but certainly that's an issue, yeah. Okay. Yes?
Mr. Carnot, is it possible for an individual to act under certain circumstances as individuals and under other kinds of circumstances as members of a collectivity? I'm looking at the Turkish scores. I mean, you expect to be zero-sum type of relationship between individuals and collectivism. So how do you explain this?
That is a very, very good question that we're still trying to grapple with right now. I'm not sure. I think what is happening may well be in Turkey that we're seeing some sort of change in generations, or just change in general because of what's happening. If you take a look at Turkey 20 years ago and how it is today, there's been a tremendous rapid change, urbanization, more in industry, service industry, these kinds of things may be changing the culture in some way. And I'm not sure. I'm honest, I don't know. I don't have all the answers, thank goodness. But anyway, seriously.
And just thinking about what Professor Hepper said, it's like, for instance, from America but living in Turkey, and you just characterized Americans as being more individualistic, but I'm the one here at Bilkent in my unit who always brings the cookies, etc. So I am an example of that balance right there of individualism and collectivism.
That could be, yeah. You know, it's an interesting question. And I think that one of the nice things about this research is that we're in a stage where there's been very little done. And that hopefully colleagues, students will be encouraged by what we're doing and work on this, because it's not an easy area, but it's a fun area. It certainly stimulated me. And frankly, I wasn't involved in this till I came to Turkey, when I made I was at Hacettepe, and 3 students were meeting with their doctoral supervisor, and they asked me to sit in, and I said to them, look, you know, they were doing their study. I said, why don't you do what we call a 360-degree evaluation, where you were evaluated by your superior, your coworkers, and your subordinate. And you know what they did? They looked at me and laughed. They said, you can't do that in Turkey. Why? Because you don't criticize the supervisor, 1. 2, so the data would be rotten there. What is the term that Turks use to talk about their coworkers? When I ask them, my students, they always give the same answer. Friend. And friend has a connotation. Do you criticize your friends? Would you do that on an evaluation? That's how I got involved in this, frankly.
Okay, time is more or less up, so let me just, first I want to thank library staff and so on who worked very hard to organise the talk, and to inform you that next month our 3rd and final lunchtime lecture will be quite a tasty venture. Professor Ulrike Sausner from the chemistry department will be coming to talk about chemistry and food and cooking and so on. She may or may not be bringing some samples. But let's put our hands together again and thank you.